Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, a monthly forum featuring activists and experts whose opinions are rarely, if ever, heard on mainstream airwaves. Other Voices is brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, the leading grassroots activist organization on the peninsula. I'm your host, Paul George. On this month's edition of Other Voices, we're going to take a look, sometimes critically, at the recent thawing of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. The United States has opened a diplomatic door to Cuba. The question is, how wide open will that door eventually swing? In the words of one journalist for the Guardian newspaper of London, this opening may represent, quote, a breakthrough in U.S. Cuban relations after a wasted half-century of mindless hostility and sanctions. Is the mindless hostility going to go away? That's what we're here to find out. And we have three very excellent guests to take us through this. All three of them have just recently been on a trip to Cuba. We'll hear a lot about that and are otherwise well-versed on the issues. Let me start directly to my right here. Richard Hobbs is an immigration attorney, community activist, and is the executive director of Human Agenda, which recently organized two emulation tours to Cuba, and we'll find out what an emulation tour is. It's a very interesting idea. He also serves as the coordinator of the Cooperative Economics Working Group of the U.S. Social Forum and of the Santa Clara Valley Cooperatives Collaborative. Richard is knowledgeable about the new Cuban cooperatives. Next to him is Greg Miller, who worked as a hospital staff nurse for 37 years. He is a longtime activist in the California Nurses Association and is now active in the Campaign for a Healthy California, which I think a lot of people in this audience probably are too, to create a single-payer Medicare for all system in this state and ultimately the United States. He has participated in two tours to Cuba in 2011 and again just this year. And at the, I should say, far left end of the table is, and returning to Other Voices and the Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, Karen Lee Wald is a writer, researcher, and teacher who has spent nearly 5 decades writing about Cuba, dividing her time between California, where her children were born, and Havana, where they grew up. She speaks she speaks frequently on a wide range of subjects and views the new stage of U.S.-Cuba relations with both joy and skepticism. And that's what we're here to explore. Thank you all for coming on Other Voices. I appreciate you taking your time. So let's just start with, what is it that's happening? What's thawing out? What is changing in terms of the U.S. long-term embargo? Why don't we start with you, Karen?
Right. And that's the key question. What is changing? Because all of the hype that we got on December 17th, and make no mistake, December 17th, the announcements made by President Raul Castro in Cuba and President Obama here about the first steps that were being taken to establish diplomatic relations after they'd been broken for 5 decades was very important. Even more important was the single most concrete thing, which you didn't mention, but which is the only thing that we definitely have already, is that the remaining 3 Cuban prisoners of the Cuban 5 who were in prison, at least 2 of whom we never expected to see out again, were instantly freed on that day. And at some point we need to talk about what that meant. Cuba freeing Alan Gross, Alan Gross, a subcontractor for USAID, whose job was to help the USAID bring about regime change in Cuba, as compared to the 5 Cubans who were initially imprisoned, spent 15 years or more in prison, trying to protect Cuba against the terrorist actions launched primarily from Miami against their country. And for a long time, the spokespeople from Washington were saying, no, they're not the same thing. It's true, as you could see from what I just described. They're not the same thing, and we're saying there could be no exchange, no releasing of the Cuban 5 for the release of American Alan Gross. And the fact that those were all released on that date was something significant, and no matter what other doubts or skepticism we may have about other aspects, that was a clear victory.
Yes.
A second victory, which didn't happen finally until a couple of days ago, was taking Cuba off of the U.S. self-proclaimed list of terrorist countries. And that was something that Ronald Reagan did, and which every president, Democrat or Republican since then, has maintained, that Cuba is on the list of terrorist countries. That may sound like, well, it's just the U.S. bad-mouthing Cuba, as it does in lots of other ways, but it had many concrete effects because, for instance, Cuba couldn't get a bank to be their banker because the banks were afraid of getting charged, as the U.S. has charged them, millions and billions of dollars in fines for dealing with a terrorist nation. So that both business and banking interests are significantly affected by that.
I think it's worth pointing out or reminding people at this point why Cuba was put on that terrorist list in the first place, and it was for backing liberation movements in Africa.
Right.
That was their terrorism.
The original was because they were helping Africa and Latin America, but more, I think Wayne Smith, who an American diplomat who eventually spent most of his time trying to talk about how crazy U.S. policy toward Cuba was, once said that U.S. policy is like a werewolf baying at the full moon, that it often has no rhyme or rhythm. I think that more than any of the specific excuses that were given over the decades for putting the Cuba on the bad list, or starting in the Reagan period, the so-called terrorist list, was more that the United States was afraid that Cuba was setting an example that other small and third world countries might want to emulate, which I think Richard is going to explain a little bit more about our emulation tours. But I think that the idea that Cuba could be an example to other countries was what the United States was most afraid of, and certainly not the support for the movements, liberation movements, anti-colonial movements in other countries. That was important, but most of that had already ended, and the U.S. measures against Cuba had not ended. So I think what the Reverend Lucius Walker once said, that every time Cuba complied with, or the situation changed regarding the excuse that the U.S. was currently using to maintain its blockade of Cuba and to engage in hostile measures against Cuba, every time that situation changed, the U.S. moved the goalposts. The U.S. changed the reason.
Yeah. Let me get the initial take from our other two guests. Richard, why don't you...
Well, as
what has been accomplished here
I think it's a two-step process. The first is diplomatic relations, and the second is normalizing relations with Cuba, really. And in terms of diplomatic relations, there have been talks. Relations are not normalized yet. For example, unlike Vietnam, in order for Americans to visit Cuba, they have to go on one of 12 licenses still. Including people-to-people licenses, which is what we were on when we went to Cuba earlier this year. And so some of those obstacles to people visiting Cuba, and Cuba actually being enabled to help the United States, because there are a number of emulations, I would say, from Cuba that could be of great impact for the American people. including, for example, Cuba has an amazing system around disaster relief. They have some of the most advanced medical solutions in the world. They have an education system second to none in the world, whereby anybody can attend school for free throughout their entire lives, including from preschool to adult education to a PhD. And so there are a number, the healthcare system, which Greg will talk about, I'm sure, is also second to none. So we have the opportunity here to learn what solidarity really means from the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution that took place in 1959 and which ultimately led to the nationalization and socialization of the means of production in Cuba, all foreign corporations taking control of the land that was in the hands of foreign corporations, is very unique. It's the only real revolution in Latin America. If we talk about Venezuela, for example, the state and the economy really is still in the hands of large capital. And in Cuba, it's not. It's truly in the hands of the state, and some people would call it the people, some people would call it the state. I think I'll end by just saying there are three visions of socialism in Cuba that are being discussed right now. One is a vision where the state should basically remain in control as it has been for the prior decades in Cuba until the lineamientos, the new guidelines that came out in the last 4 or 5 years. Another says that Cuba should focus just on trying to increase its productive forces so that there is more to distribute. But that same vision of socialism also is not that concerned about the exploitation of people in Cuba. And so it's really pretty much discarded. And the third really has to do with more of a vision of social democracy, a democratic socialism in Cuba, where the goal is really the full development of the human being in Cuba. And in my mind, these changes in Cuba over the last 4 or 5 years have really led into that direction. It's empowering the Cuban people not only to be more productive and to increase their wages and their consumption, which is important in Cuba, but it's also localizing democracy. It's giving people who have been, for example, working in a large state enterprise for decades, the capacity to work in a group of 15 to 20 or 30 people in a cooperative setting, which we'll talk about later. And that is enhancing democracy, equality, the caring of people because they're their own production unit, and sustainability in Cuba. And so these are all, I think, really positive developments in Cuba.
Great. And Greg, your initial take on the thaw that was announced on December 17th.
Well, it sounds positive, and you know, I would have the same concerns that Karen expressed, that it's, you know, that when Obama made his announcement, he was pretty clear that he is still against the system in Cuba, wants to change the system, wants to change the government, the regime, do a regime change basically, just by a different means. So as far as that's concerned, what I'm impressed with, of course, have worked in healthcare a long time, and I'm very impressed with their health system, the scope and the sophistication of their healthcare system. They cover everybody. They have doctors' offices, clinics, hospitals available throughout the island, easily available to everybody. Unlike what they have here, right, where you're always worried whether you're going to be able to, get into the system and how you're going to pay for it. Well, they don't have to worry about that. It's totally free. They spend about 49% of their budget on health and education, and the results show the success of their system in that their life expectancy is similar to the U.S. Their infant mortality is actually even better than the United States. And of course, then the other thing is it's a society based on solidarity. That's very impressive. They even during this very difficult crisis period, they maintained these services and did not let them, did not let them slide. And the whole thing is developing. Let everybody should be able to develop fully and be as productive and successful as possible. Have that opportunity, everyone in society, without exception, and that means providing the basics: healthcare, education, housing, food. It's to me a very impressive system, and I think anybody who would go there would be impressed.
Let's talk, before we get into talking about your trip and how impressed you all were, let's talk about the government-to-government stuff and some of the nuts and bolts that has to be done. Because the embargo of Cuba has many elements to it. Karen, you mentioned the state sponsor of terrorism list that Cuba has just been removed from as part of this thought. So that's one that was under the control of the administration, basically. The State Department makes that list and says who goes on and off of it. But other essential elements of the embargo, the sanctions, the barring ships that have called at Cuba from calling directly on a U.S. port, those are congressional bills. And Congress is going to have to pass something new to reverse those if relations are really going to normalize with Cuba. Now, I look at this Congress, and I just have trouble believing that anything close to that is going to happen anytime soon. What's your response to that?
Well, there are two aspects of it. One is whether or not the changes that you mentioned, the ending of the economic blockade, the economic warfare against Cuba is going to be ended by this Congress. The other is what the objectives in these changes are. That is, if the Republicans see the purpose of making these changes, the economic changes, as furthering the same interests that Obama and his administration have clearly expressed as the reasons for changing the diplomatic relations, they might very well be inclined to make those changes.
Because they'll see Cuba as a convenient market 90 miles offshore?
No, that would be too easy. I wish that were the only reason. But
You're
if
still
you
talking
look,
regime change?
if you look at everything that Obama has said from December 17th on, what his State Department spokespeople have said, there are lots of quotes. I can give them to people later on if they want. All of them have made it clear that they are changing not the relationship with the Cuban government, but with the Cuban people. Now that sounds very nice, right? They're trying to empower the people. They use lots of rhetoric similar to what we would say about giving power to the people. But what they're talking about is that the method that they used, trying to beat the people over the head and make life miserable so that they would want to change their government. That's what didn't work over the last five decades. That now what they want to do is change it and empower the people. Not empower the people to do what they're already doing, making decisions about their own future. They want to empower the people to become separate from and less dependent on their socialist government so that they will make regime change from within. That is, that they will bring about a change in the kind of government they have, that they will be tempted by what the United States is putting before them as the economic benefits of independence, free enterprise, free market system. Now, as long as that is the goal of the Obama administration or any other, anybody, Republicans, if they're smart enough, or Democrats could go along with that. The question is that the kind of change that we want to see? What
Right.
can we do to get our government to make the kind of real changes in relations? We can't say to restore normal normal relations with Cuba. There have never been normal relations
not with this government, no.
with Cuba since Thomas Jefferson was in office. All the United States has done and all it has said and all it has attempted is to dominate Cuba, to make Cuba part of the Monroe Doctrine, to make Cuba part of I think they called it the theory of the falling fruit, that Cuba was, dangling like a ripe fruit so close to our shores, and that it was logical that that we should pick it up. The Platt Amendment in 1900, and a number of times after that, the United States invaded Cuba, basically just because what they said and what McKinley said, what every regime in Washington has said is, we know better than you do what's good for you. And so we are going to intervene when we need to make sure that things go our way. Mm-hmm. And that is not, if you look at all the quotes since December 17th, that is what they are trying to do, to bring about a change in the government and the economic, political, and social system of Cuba so that it will be more convenient for the United States.
You got a take on this, Richard?
No, I believe that it will be difficult to get this Republican Congress to take action. However, I think there's been a fundamental shift, and none of this initiative really could have happened without that, and that is that the Miami lobby is really weak. As we know, historically, really for the last several decades, every single vote in the United Nations and other international organizations have basically been 180 to 2, and or thereabouts, with the United States and typically Israel being the second vote in support of trying to completely isolate Cuba on a number of votes in the United Nations and other regional organizations. I think it became clear to the United States that the whole world was laughing at the United States. And in my opinion, this development of opening diplomatic relations and normalizing relations with Cuba is really a victory of the Cuban people and the defeat of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that's my take.
Yeah. Well, I do want to just mention a couple of things that were in the news just today and yesterday. A committee in the House of Representatives inserted into the transportation bill a bar for Americans to travel to Cuba. Yeah, they want to get in on that, and they inserted into an appropriations bill a specific ban on any money being spent on building a new embassy in Cuba. And so I think we're going to see a lot of this constantly. So I don't know that the full trade embargo will come off, but I can sure, one of the leading industries in calling for at least an easing of the sanctions for many years now has been agriculture in this country, because they see a ready market very close to shore. So I can see the U.S. Congress and the administration picking off pieces of the Cuban economy. Am I close to the mark? Do you think that's right? We'll see food exports going to Cuba?
Well, food exports are already happening
to
Cuba.
Something like 400 million a year, I think.
Well, I was actually just at a conference yesterday. I came back from New York City last night at the City University of New York, and they had a one-day conference on the Cuban economy. And so what was shared at that conference was that that Cuba actually imports $2.2 billion a year of food. And this is one of the reasons why the new guidelines of Cuba that came out of an immense dialogue with the Cuban people, and it's beginning to move the Cuban economy in a new direction. They recognized that they had a lot of very well-educated Cubans, because a lot of them, of course, have access to free university education, and yet the agricultural and the production sector was really lacking. And so one of the goals of the new guidelines is to move the ratio, which is right now 70% service sector and 30% production sector, to 50-50. And so there are a number of initiatives, including cooperatives, including agricultural cooperatives, although we went there to look at non-agricultural cooperatives, which is the new change in Cuba. There are a number of initiatives to try to get people, back on the land, back into production in order to raise the productivity level and increase, especially the agricultural output in Cuba, so that the dependence on agricultural imports will be lessened. That's one of the goals of the changes in Cuba.
All right.
And one of the comments that a number of experts on both Cuba and Washington have made is that those congressmen who are putting those clauses into various bills, that's mostly posturing. It's posturing for their electorate, not because they really think or even necessarily really want those things to take place. There is somewhat of a difference between what American business wants in terms of Cuba, as Richard pointed out, and in terms of being able to sell to Cuba, and what the politicians in Washington want out of all of this.
Yeah.
I think that those things aren't mutually exclusive at all, that there are people who would really like to just see what they can do to lure Cubans into overturning this kind of political system, and there are people who simply want to do business.
Let's talk about business briefly, and then I want to get some experiences from your trips. There are other countries right now that are making investments in Cuba and building hotels and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. How does that work, and how will that work with the United States, do you think? What's the system? Cuba keeps some control of this. It doesn't just, who wants to take that? You're all nodding your heads.
We agree.
Well, I'll just say I think that there are four major sectors of the Cuban economy, and obviously, historically, it's been dominated by the state sector. That's been true really since the nationalizations from 1962 and that period forward. But at the same time, actually, it's interesting in agriculture, a majority of agriculture in Cuba actually comes from cooperatives. These are not the same cooperatives I think that a lot of the Cuban people would like to see. Most of them, some of them began as basically consumer agricultural cooperatives, which are fine, but leaving a lot of the small agricultural farmers in place, private farmers. But then there were two other waves of cooperatives in agriculture that were produced. At any rate, I'm sure that it's one of the very few countries where a majority of agriculture is produced by cooperatives. So there is a history of the cooperative sector in agriculture. What's new and why we took our trip this year was to see the new service and industrial cooperatives in Cuba, which I'll talk about later. Another area that was allowed in 2010, after the guidelines were thoroughly discussed, was the cuenta propistas. Cuenta propistas are small businesses, and for the first time in the history of Cuba, these small businesses can employ people. They cannot export, and they have a limit on size. The biggest small business in Cuba right now has, I believe, about 47 employees, which is actually beyond what the law allows. But they're allowing it to happen at this time. I mean, 47 is still not, Walmart.
or GE or something.
Or GE.
Yeah.
And then the other sector is the one that you're mentioning, and that is U.S. foreign investment. With U.S. foreign investment, I think they are anticipating a significant growth, a growth of 50% in the amount of corporate income tax that Cuba will be getting from corporations. However, these are not corporations that can just come into Cuba with 100% capital and get out with all of the super exploitation that has gone on in Latin America for the last 50 years. These are shared projects with the government. They're joint stock companies. The government has said very clearly throughout in every single period in the last 5 years that it intends to keep strategic control of the Cuban economy, which means keeping control of the land, in all of the cooperatives. In fact, it also owns the buildings of the cooperatives and other strategic resources of the economy. And so I don't believe necessarily that a hotel that produces the income that Cuba needs to raise its standard of living is considered strategic. But at the same time, the Cuban government will maintain a majority of control, even of investments from the United States.
Yep. And what Richard is mentioning is very important, because a lot of good, well-meaning people in this country have expressed concern about these changes because they're worried that McDonald's is going to take over Cuba, that or McDonald's type of businesses. And what Cubans respond is that they just haven't been paying attention. We have been dealing with, we have had investments from Canada, a number of European countries, Latin American, Mexico, capitalist countries. We know how to handle capitalist countries and investment. We have laws on the books. We have regulations. We know how to do this, and we're not going to let them just walk all over us and just turn us into a mini Miami.
That was kind of my point. There was Ralph Nader had a piece shortly after the thaw was announced, and he is saying it is not likely that Cubans can hold true to their principles in the face of an unimpeded flood of U.S. junk food, credit gouging, deceptive TV advertising, one-sided fine print contract, on and on. It's a nice summary of what U.S. culture does in other countries.
But the key word was unimpeded,
Yeah.
and it will not be
It will
unimpeded.
not be unimpeded. Yeah. All right, let's talk about your trip. Let's get to the audience for some questions, because they're always a big part. What the heck is an emulation trip? Greg, you haven't said anything for a while. You want to explain this?
Well, actually, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I think we were just trying to. I was there to see what they're doing and how they're developing their society. I've always been interested in socialist countries. Okay, just the whole goal supposedly of socialism is to develop a society in a way that benefits everybody. So I wanted to see to what extent that's really happening in Cuba, and I think it is. It was definitely, empowers the people in many ways. So I was impressed.
What would you want to emulate in terms of health care?
I would want to see, free access to health care in this country. I'd like, where you don't have to stress-free is what I mean. Where you don't have to worry about whether you can afford health care, and they have that in Cuba.
Kind of like what you're working for on the single-payer campaign.
Yeah, like was looking into the history a bit, and before the revolution in 1959, I think they had one hospital outside the city of Havana. One hospital, that's all. And they had, they went around with tin cups asking for money for the hospitals that did exist in Havana. That's how they funded their health system, right? So of course, there was tremendous poverty, and most people did not have access to good health care. So now you have this exemplary, ALAM, what they call the School of Latin American Medicine, which we visited, where they have students from 120 countries. This was the school was established about 12, 15 years ago, approximately, and as Richard was saying, they're famous for missions across, to other countries to help them during disasters and things like that, and so they got the idea of let's also help these countries develop their own health systems, right? And they're doing that in Venezuela. They have doctors there training doctors in Venezuela, right, in the barrios, okay, in the poor areas, and that's the point of the School of Medicine, is that it's free education for these students, and they have to commit to going back and serving the underserved communities that they came from. So they're being empowered. Poor poor kids from these other countries are being powered, and they're helping their,
Do you have any idea what the enrollment is? How many students have gone
I'm forgetting what the figures is. There's hundreds of students there. I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
through this every year?
Yeah.
We-
And
we've-
also the other thing that's impressed me about their medical education is that they combine right off the bat. They combine clinical with book learning. So they start right at the beginning with you're exposed to patients and you're working with
Very
patients.
practical.
Yeah.
Just quickly, before we leave healthcare, we'll come back to it, I'm sure, but we've heard a lot of stories, and I don't know how to judge them, about various medicines and vaccines that Cuba has developed in this period of isolation. Are these as great as they sound?
Yeah,
And should we be
it
lifting
sounds-
the embargo to be importing stuff from there?
Well, exactly. They have invented hepatitis, meningitis, influenza vaccines, treatments for diabetic foot ulcers, and what I understand is that this is where they are working with joint venture corporations, doing joint venture projects to produce these things that they developed, that they invented, probably I think overseas with through these other corporations. So they're very advanced in their what do you say, their medical knowledge.
Yeah. They've put a lot into it. Education and healthcare have been kind of the hallmarks of the revolution, I think. All right, you explain what an emulation tour is, and it was your idea, apparently.
Yeah, it is.
Well, emulation really comes, although Karen can probably explain this more, it comes from a practice in Cuba whereby certain individuals who have shown really outstanding effort and motivation and results are emulatable in their field, whatever field that may be in the Cuban economy, and in the Cuban political system and the social system. And so to us, looking at a vision for a better world, which is something that Human Agenda has been working on for the last 14 years, looking at this vision around the values that we hold, which are democracy, equality, cooperation, kindness, and sustainability, we wanted to find out, which sectors of the Cuban economy really can provide an example for the world. And what we found, for example, I can talk about cooperatives later, but when I, as
Feel
the
free to
person,
talk about it now, because there's not much later.
okay, there's not
left.
much later. Okay, well, I've asked people, because I'm the moderator of Move to Amend, which is trying to get a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. I'm the moderator here in Santa Clara County. We've asked people at different forums, do you think that the U.S. Corporation is democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, kind, and sustainable? And guess how people react? It's exactly what the audience is doing, which is laughing. And so our purpose in going to Cuba, in part, was to see if the new cooperatives meet that bill. And what we found is that there is a new law of cooperatives that went into effect on November 15, 2012. Originally, it was designed to have 248 cooperatives. As of today, there are 397 non-agricultural cooperatives under this experimental law, and they specifically call it experimental. Most of the cooperatives in Cuba that have come into existence in the last couple of years are cooperatives that were state enterprises that were not doing very well, honestly, including a number of restaurants, for example. We visited a construction cooperative. We visited a sewing cooperative. And some of these were not doing that well under state control. But I have to say that what we witnessed was really an amazing phenomenon, that people that were in these production units of, let's say, I think we saw from maybe 6 to Actually, I think 103 in the biggest cooperative we saw, which was the Rutero Dos, the bus lines in Western Havana. It was a bus cooperative. And in all of those cooperatives, I think what we saw was just totally amazing. People have, they're worker owners, and so they do, each one of them have to invest in the cooperative. It's not a high investment because the Cuban people don't have a lot of money, but they do have one worker, one vote, which means the General Assembly of their cooperative is the highest decision-making body, and through that General Assembly and then through other mediated organizations inside the cooperative, I think that the people have been able to, number one, exercise much more direct democratic control over their workplace than they were under some of the state enterprises in Cuba. Number two, radically improve the productivity of the workplace, and that's really tied to motivation, in my opinion. But the productivity and the amount of innovation that has gone on has been really amazing in all of the cooperatives that we visited. Number three, we saw a highly egalitarian system inside the cooperatives. When we looked at the ratio between the highest paid and the lowest paid, it rarely reached 1 to 2. Unlike Silicon Valley, which is 1 to 400, in the Cuban cooperatives, it was really more like 1 to 1.6, that ratio in terms of the highest paid to the lowest paid. So much more egalitarian than really anything we see in the United States.
And the highest paid is no doubt not taking home $1 million bonuses.
Right. And then I guess finally, all of them were extremely pleased to raise their standard of living, because what we saw is that the people in the cooperatives have raised their income basically fivefold. As an average, I would say about 5 times. The cooperative that perhaps earned the least, that is still actually transitioning from an agricultural cooperative to a service cooperative, was making maybe 3 times more, but then we had other positions inside the for example, the bus cooperative in Western Havana, where the mechanics were making 10 times more than they were making before the cooperative was established. And so this is really elevating the living standards of the Cuban people, which has been an issue, frankly, and the Cuban government will be the first to say it, that the Cuban people deserve to have a slightly higher level of consumption, even though they have all of their basic needs met, or almost all of their basic needs met. There is an understanding that Cuba needs to elevate the living standards of the Cuban people.
And when Richard suggested that our second emulation tour focus on cooperatives, that was extremely important for a number of reasons. An emulation tour is to go to some country or some place in this country where people are doing things that we might want to emulate. We might want to try to do something similar, maybe with our own differences, but to look at that as an example that we might want to follow.
Kind of a practical learning thing.
The reason, in addition to all of the things that Richard has mentioned and many more that we could go into, but to me it's especially important to look at the cooperatives in that sense, because the cooperatives are totally consistent with a socialist concept of how to run an economy. That is, as compared to what what Washington is pushing and what many people mistakenly think is a good way to support Cubans through their private enterprises, the cuentapropistas, the people who are working privately, who are renting out private rooms in their homes, Airbnb, who are running private restaurants. All of those things are okay because they're helping the Cuban economy survive in a time when the world economy is in very, very bad shape.
And they're kept very small scale.
And they're necessary, but they're not as good as the cooperatives, because the cooperatives are saying, for instance, the beauty parlor and the barber shop around the corner from where I live in Havana, along with the restaurant around the corner. All of those, the same workers who were working all along became the owners and as well as the workers and the managers of their own workplace. It's not one person who happened to have the means to run a restaurant, out of their home, and all of the money coming from that is going into that family's pockets, right? If they're employing people, they're working on this, they're not yet labor unions or other structures to make sure that they're going to get the same guarantees that Cuban workers did get through their unions and in their workplaces before. All of those are necessary, but cooperatives are, in my opinion, and I think in everybody in our group who visited these cooperatives, the way to go, because they're not a method of trying to bring down a socialist collectivist concept of running the economy. They're trying to improve it. They're trying to make socialism more viable in Cuba, and cooperatives are one way to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let's get the audience in on this. If you have a question or a comment, just raise your hand. Wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. There's more equipment here. She's got to find her way through. And if you would stand up to make it easier on our camera folks.
Hi, are you planning more emulation tours in future? And if so, how can anyone interested get more details?
Yes, we are planning.
And how much did you pay him to be in the audience and ask that question?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll just say a little bit. First of all, Human Agenda is part of the local organizing committee of the U.S. Social Forum, which is going to be held in San Jose, June 24th to the 28th. Human Agenda's contribution, I believe, is around the vision for a better world, including a vision for a better United States, which includes a number of components that we don't have time to go into here. But certainly the values of Human Agenda around institutions that are democratic, egalitarian, kind, cooperative, and sustainable are the values that we're seeking whenever we go outside the United States or inside the United States. We also want to do local emulation tours. For example, we took an emulation tour to the Mondragon cooperatives in northern Spain, which are perhaps the poster child of a cooperative network, where I've seen actually through generations, like in Cuba, of a cooperative solidarity economy, the actual psyche of the people has transformed. People don't think about themselves first. Literally, the institutions have transformed human nature. I would say I've seen that not only in Cuba, but also in Mondragon, which is an area of about 100,000 worker owners with 256 cooperatives that began in 1956 under Franco. But these are examples, I think, where we need to learn from how to create the institutions that can begin to actually change human beings in our country. And so, yes, we're planning to go back to Cuba, and we're planning to go back to Mondragon and to other examples where we think the United States can learn a lot. And I'll be glad to give you that information later.
You have a website?
We do. You can go to www.humanagenda.net.
Humanagenda.net. Okay, another question here in our audience, and then another one.
If the cooperatives need more labor, do they hire workers, or do they recruit workers into the cooperatives, or is there some combination thereof? And what rules do they, function under?
That's a good question. There is a limit based on the law that came out on November 15, 2012, which basically says that cooperatives can hire individuals, non-cooperative members, for up to a period of 3 months. And after 3 months, they either have to offer them to join the cooperative or to dismiss them. And so this is an effort not to not to evolve cooperatives into basically becoming employers instead of cooperatives. There are definite limits on the number of employees that a cooperative can have and how long they can be in existence.
Okay.
I'm wondering if they still have the double system of the peso and the dollar. If they're still using the dollar economy and the peso economy.
Good question.
Right. The question was whether there's still a dual currency or triple currency economy going on, and that is something that the Cubans are working very hard to eliminate. It came about out of necessity because of the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba and pressure on banking institutions to not allow Cuba to pay with or handle U.S. dollars, and so that they created sort of monopoly money, funny money. They what's called the CUC, C-U-C, which is the equivalent of dollars, but only used internally. The problem with having any kind of dual economy, whether it's U.S. dollars or the CUCs, is that some people have more access to them than others. People who have relatives abroad and who are sending remittances have more access. People who are working in any of the tourist industry, including the taxis, who get tips in foreign currency have more access. And so it creates an inequality in the Cuban economy that, of course, the leaders and the idealists of the Cuban Revolution didn't want to see happen. It's not the way that they would like to see Cuba. It was a necessity. For the first time, one of my friends and neighbors works in economic research, and initially when I was asking her a few years ago how long it was going to take to get rid of the dual economy, because it's not a question whether it's a goal, it's definitely a goal to get rid of it. But initially she was saying, oh, at least 10 years. Now they're hoping in the next year or two. So they're working very hard on getting rid of that dual economy because it's not something that anybody wants. It was developed out of necessity, and hopefully within a year or two it will be gone.
If U.S. tourism increases, does that play into this in any way? U.S. tourists bringing in dollars?
Well, U.S. tourism will improve the Cuban economy. They're expecting a 6% growth in corporate income tax based upon a 20% annual growth of tourism. Already 30% of the American people have said they'd like to visit Cuba in a recent poll. And in fact, the tourism has increased tenfold just since January 1st in Cuba. So there are... And
just because you three went?
Yeah, we started it. We were the
first wave.
I think the question has to do with whether or not that increased tourism and for example, investment in the tourist industry will have an impact on the CUCs versus the Cuban pesos. Right now, the rate is 24 to 1, 24 Cuban pesos to 1 CUC. And it's pretty clear that the major problems that they're having is that different industries in Cuba have basically set up their internal financial systems based upon one or the other. And they have not really been able to come up with a single system for reporting and financing, and that's really what they're working on right now. It's not that you can easily go from 24 to 1 and just say, you know, this is going to be a new whatever. This is going to be the new Cuban peso, like they did in Mexico many times, you know, with the devaluations. This can be the new Cuban peso, but the question is, you know, what are the impacts on different enterprises in Cuba, and that's what they're working on right now, is to try to develop one internal financing mechanism so that everyone is basically playing with the same institutions.
And there are two other factors that will influence that. One is what we mentioned before, taking Cuba off of the U.S. terrorist list of countries sponsoring terrorism enables both companies and banks to trade with Cuba using any currency, including U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
But the Cubans have been saying consistently, in terms of being able to unify the currency, that it depends on productivity. That the bottom line is that Cubans have to be productive enough in whatever area they work, whether it's agricultural, industrial, or service, so that the value of the Cuban peso increases because of that productivity. Once the Cuban peso can be a convertible currency, then they don't need the kooks. They won't need them anymore because of getting off of the terrorist list, but the most important factor is for Cubans to continue to become more productive.
All right. We're almost out of time, so we'll go one more audience question here. And if you can be really fast, maybe we'll slip in one more.
Okay. Raul Castro said that relations with the U.S. will not be normalized until the issue of Guantanamo Bay is resolved. So I'm just wondering what the panelists think will happen with Guantanamo Bay, when and if you think it will be resolved, and how.
Right. I think there are a number of factors, and certainly the United States owning a part of Cuban territory against the will of the Cuban people and the Cuban government is one of them. The United States, we won't have time to go into all of this, but the United States intervened in the Spanish-Cuban War when the last of Spain's colonies at the end of the 19th century had almost totally defeated Spain, and it was worn out from fighting everywhere from Latin America to the Philippines, and the United States saw the opportunity, moved in, and then declared victory. When it settled with Spain, Cuba wasn't even at the negotiating table, nor were any of the other countries that the United States picked up. And what they did was they gave the impression of Cuba becoming independent, but with a governor appointed by the United States, and with the so-called Platt Amendment. The amendment to the Cuban Constitution at that time gave the United States government the right to intervene in Cuba anytime that it saw fit, for its own interests, both militarily and economically, which it did, and it gave the U.S. a base in Guantanamo province for 99 years. That 99 years is up.
Try to wrap this up, because we're
The
almost
99 years is up, but the Cuba basically doesn't have the power to throw the United States out, but it is hoping that one of the measures that will take place as a result of these negotiations that are beginning now will be that the United States will withdraw at the request of the Cuban government. The Cuban government does not want the United States to have a base there.
It's going to be another interesting discussion with the people in Congress. So about 20 seconds each. You want to leave us with something?
I will. The new law of cooperatives is going to enter into effect next January of 2016. They're anticipating to have 3,000, to go from 397 to 3,000 cooperatives under the next period. And a lot of those, pretty much all of the paladares, which are the restaurants, will become cooperatives. That's the direction of cooperatives in Cuba. I think it's a very positive direction.
20 seconds, Greg.
I just, having visited it 4 years ago, my general impression is that things are looking up. I mean, I just felt a general more sort of a spirit of optimism, and that I didn't see quite as much of 4 years ago.
Nice to hear that. Karen, 20 seconds.
What the Cubans said at the time of the December 17th agreement was that it was a shame that the United States only wanted to change the método en vez de la meta. That is, they wanted to change the method, but not the goal, the objective. And I think what we can do is be contacting our members of Congress and the administration, the Obama administration or whoever follows, to say, we don't want you to just find a more effective way to pursue the same goal. We would like the goal to change.
My thanks to Karen Lee Wald, Greg Miller, and Richard Hobbs. Thank you to all you for attending in person and for watching at home. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next month.